Hello and welcome to the second of the previews of lectures. This session or this video relates to week 3, culture and its consequences, and it builds upon the work that we've done, but rather than in week 2 where we looked at more general issues and concerns and reflections on culture, and we looked at the typologies of business cultures, this one looks directly at international differences in culture, and so is particularly relevant to your consulting exercise. We're going to be looking at the extent to which culture might impact behaviour. We're going to be looking at similarities and differences in national cultures, and we're also going to be looking at some of the consequences of these differences. We already said previously that culture is a very unwieldy concept or notion, and it's actually like pinning jelly down or trying to hammer jelly down. It's even trickier in an international setting. It's even more diverse, complicated, and subject to different interpretations. Some people argue that we're moving more and more towards a global culture. We're becoming more similar, that actually we're becoming one. But there's quite a lot of arguments against this, and I want you to realise that although in some ways there are some elements in a so-called global culture, actually, people talk about the global village and so on, but actually there are still quite marked differences between us. In fact, this argument was put forward as long ago as over 60 years ago now by Raymond Williams in his landmark piece From a Critical Marxist Position on Culture and Society. He said, clearly we have different national cultures, and we can identify and we can spot these, different ethnic calls, legends, stories, events, different emotions of people. There are clearly differences in national culture. But he argued that this notion that we're all moving towards a global culture was a bit of a myth. He said that it's a product of Western media, and there's actually very few global stories or examples where there's been a complete coming together into a global culture. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in the class. What we want to do is to move back on the influence of culture on management practices, and this runs to the core of your consulting exercise. What we're going to be talking about is a couple of frameworks, and one we're going to focus in particular where scholars have attempted to develop clusters of countries identifying similarities and differences in culture, i.e. their values and beliefs. And you've probably heard of Hofstede before, but Geert Hofstede's work, a Dutch academic, is particularly important and particularly popular in this field. So this will act as a very good platform for you to provide or for you to do analysis and provide guidance to your German clients on the sort of issues that they will face as they enter into their new country. Okay. Hofstede's work then, just describing what it's about. It focuses on international differences in work-related values. Essentially, Hofstede's initial study was a study of one big multinational corporation, IBM, and then he analysed these differences between managers of different nationalities and in the different locations in which IBM worked. So, in other words, what he was trying to do was to identify the differences between different managers, and by extension trying to understand the different cultures from which they emanated. He defined culture, we looked at definitions before, but he defined it as collective mental programming of people in the environment. And his argument was that there are differences in employee motivation, management approaches and style, and also in the most productive or the preferred organisation structures throughout the world. And he argued this is because of the different conditioning and the different ways in which we want to work from one another, depending upon where we've come from in the world and the culture from which we come. And he identified clusters. In fact, he identified dimensions from which we can measure culture, and then he clustered together similar countries and similar national cultures, and also looked at some of the differences. The idea is to provide lessons for managers of international businesses, so you can actually use this material to provide lessons and recommendations for your German clients. Okay, Hofstede, he identified 6 key dimensions of culture. Initially, he identified 4, but added 2 later on. So the first 4 were the initial dimensions. Some countries and some national cultures score low on these, some score high, and each of the dimensions are scored, a country scores between 1 up to 100 in terms of their scores, their cultural characteristics. Okay, so those are the key dimensions. What I'm going to do is look at each one of those in turn. The first variable is power distance, and this is the degree to which people are accepting that power is unequally distributed. In some societies, people are willing to accept that a small number of people hold the power, whereas in other cultures it's a lot more egalitarian, and the view is no, power shouldn't reside in just a few people, it should be distributed throughout society. Okay, so that's the first dimension. That ranges from low to high, and the notion is that take for example Northern European and Scandinavian countries. These typically score low on power distance, that they think that actually it should be an equal society and people should contribute. There shouldn't be a centralisation of power in a small number of people, whereas traditionally other countries have scored very high on that. Thinking here, for example, in India, we might have the caste system, we might have different tiers and levels of society, and the general public accepting that one person has the right to hold power, and, for example, politicians stay in office for long periods of time. Okay, so that's the first one. And you can see that people coming from different backgrounds, some people will accept power from their managers, other people will have grown up in cultures where they're more questioning of this, and they will sort of not just toe the line in terms of just following what the manager suggests. Individualism is the second one. Some societies are very individualistic, where people look after themselves first and foremost, rather than the wider needs of society or their communities, whereas other cultures, it's very much more collectivist. So if we compare, for example, many Western countries, individualism is very high, whereas for East Asian countries, we can observe a lot more collectivism in terms of society and culture. Okay, so that's the second dimension. The third one is what Hofstede termed masculinity, or put another way, the extent to which masculine attributes are favoured versus more feminine attributes. So in an organisation, this would be that in some cultures, macho management is at large, that assertiveness, competitiveness, material success are seen as absolutely key. Whereas in other societies and other cultures, female or traditional female values such as cooperation, feelings and emotions are very much more to the fore. Okay, so it's the extent to which masculinity reigns, or the extent to which there's a sort of softer approach that's adopted. The fourth variable, the last of the initial four, is uncertainty avoidance, and this is linked with uncertainty and risk. Some societies try and avoid at all costs uncomfortable or uncertain situations because they like codified situations. They like to know what's being done. Whereas in other societies, people are more willing to accept risk and in fact thrive on that. They actually enjoy the challenge of something new, something different. Very interesting comparison here is that, for example, the UK scores a lot higher on, or was a lot more willing to take on risk and uncertainty, whereas France scores very high on uncertainty avoidance. And this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because you can start to see some of the criticisms of Hofstede's work. Although this might be a general or an average tendency, in fact, the argument is that Hofstede can lead to very stereotypical views of individuals in society. So just because there's a score for British people on Hofstede's scales, that doesn't mean that everybody has exactly the same attributes. There will actually be a wide range of people. So the argument is you have to take each individual on their own merit and not come in with stereotypical views. But nonetheless, Hofstede's work is trying to sort of look at some of the sources of cultural differences. Okay, Hofstede variables there, and you will see a link on the page on the Keele pages for this week, which is to the Hofstede Centre. And I really encourage you to have a look at that, because you can go in there, you can put in a particular country, and it will show you the scores for that country on each of these 6 dimensions. And you can put in another country, and that will show you on a graph the scores for that second country, and we'll line them up one to the other. So that's quite good, because obviously you will see some cultures are quite similar and the scores are similar on some dimensions, but there can be quite varying differences in the scores on some of the other dimensions. It helps you to identify where the sources of potential conflict and cultural misunderstanding might be between one country and another. It also enables you to draw off some quite good graphics that you can contain within your consulting report for your clients, and gives you quite a nice basis, perhaps for your second meeting with the clients, to say that you had a look at these profiles and you can see some quite striking differences or some issues that they might want to be considering. There's not just the Hofstede framework, there are others. I'm particularly pointing out here the alternative framework by Trumpenaars and Hamden-Turner. They actually identified 7 different dimensions, and in fact over the last 30 years or so there's been quite a big battle between Hofstede and Trumpenaars and Hamden-Turner, and in fact they've actually challenged one another as to whose is the best framework and so on. I think the general feeling is that, well, clearly Hofstede's is the most well-known and the more popular and the one that's applied more often than not, but it's often criticised because it's seen more as a consulting tool, and some people have questioned the depth of research behind it, and also have questioned the assumptions on which it's all based. Whereas Trumpenaars and Hamden-Turner, the argument is that it's perhaps a more scholarly piece of work, perhaps not quite so difficult to get to grips with and understand, but there has been the argument against it that it's yet another attempt just to sort of collapse down a very complex issue such as culture into some form of dimensions, and can be deemed as quite simplistic in its outcomes. But have a look at Trumpenaars and Hamden-Turner as well, because it's sort of, some of them look similar to Hofstede, but some of them look quite different, don't they? So it's well worth having a look. There are links and readings on that, and you might want to bring this into your analysis as well. It'll give you a different perspective on the differences between national cultures. Okay, we're at the end now, but there is some reading on the topic. Hofstadter, I've just got one particular reference there, but there are many other readings, and Trompenaar and Hamilton Turner, their key book from 1993. But I have also put a really excellent article there by Brendan McSweeney. Brendan McSweeney was a huge critic of Hofstadter's model, and he unveils a number of core criticisms of the work, along the lines challenging the research that's being done, challenging the methodology, challenging the assumptions, and also questioning the extent to which it's just developed stereotypes in our minds. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's really well worth looking at, particularly when you come to writing your own individual assignment, because obviously the consulting project is a very applied and practical project, whereas in the essay I'm expecting you to employ critical analysis in your work. And McSweeney's work is certainly a very nice piece of work, critically analysing the state of play in international comparisons of culture, as put forward by Hofstadter. Okay, I'll leave it there, but I look forward to seeing you in the lecture. You will have watched this, so you'll get an idea as to what the material is about. So, I will encourage you in the lecture to stop me, ask questions, raise issue, and also comment as I'm talking through the lecture. Thank you very much, sir, and goodbye.